Hi, and welcome to the Mediatwits number 166. We'll be talking about diversity and how crucial it is in newsrooms today and how difficult it's been to really bring diversity into newsrooms. A recent ASNI study found that only 15% of newspapers around the U.S. had a person of color in one of its top 3 positions. We'll talk about some progress that's being made in diversity and still the challenges ahead on this week's episode of the Mediatwits. First, a word from our sponsors. Running your own business requires focus, and so does parenting. Mediatwits podcast sponsor NextSpace created a place where parents could give their best quality of attention to both. Co-working space and childcare space under one roof. Learn more at nextspace.us/nextkids. And we also want to let you know that Media Shift is putting on a Collab Space Innovation Workshop in New York City on July 15th at the Ford Foundation. Sponsored by the Donald W. Reynolds Journalism Institute, CollabSpace will spotlight 8 entrepreneurial projects at media and tech companies, including The Atlantic, Thomson Reuters, and Google. Learn more at bit.ly/collabnyc15 and use the Collab20 promotional code on Eventbrite for 20% off the entry fee. So before we get into our discussion, I want to introduce our panel this week. We have Alicia Stewart joining us as a Nieman Fellow at Harvard, George Kelly of Digital First Media Bay Area News Group, Gustavo Arellano, editor at the OC Weekly, Jeff Yang, columnist at the Wall Street Journal, and our producer, Jefferson Yen in Los Angeles. So diversity, this has been something that's been talked about among journalists in newsrooms at media companies for decades, the issues and the problems, and especially with all the news stories that have been coming out lately, the shooting that happened in Charleston at a church, NAACP leader who was white but identified as black. We've had so many stories recently about it, and yet newsrooms still stubbornly don't really represent the communities that they're covering, and especially in the leadership positions. Alicia, you recently, there was really a whole series in the Nieman reports about race and newsrooms, and you kind of had a really great in-depth story about the problems in the past and also some things that are happening that are good. What do you see as kind of the bad news and the good news when it comes to diversity?
Thank you, Mark, first of all, for the opportunity to talk about it. And I think kudos goes to the Nieman Foundation and Nieman Reports for just taking the time and the space to really look in depth from a variety of angles at the issue. I think the good news is, look, we are in an unprecedented era for change, and so the opportunity to start from scratch and learn from the lessons that we've maybe failed at in the past is just an excellent opportunity. And anytime you get that chance, which is really rare, is an opportunity. And that's why I thought it was really important to start by talking to some of those companies in the piece, like Vox Media, who had kind of faced that head-on within the journalism industry, who was faced with the question of who they were hiring, how they were hiring, and how that impacted their journalism. I think the news is that we could be looking at to improve upon really is how we integrate that into current newsrooms and organizations that maybe haven't fully been able to have the inclusive newsrooms to impact editorial and business initiatives in meaningful ways, and articulating that very specifically, cogently, and strategically for both business and editorial imperatives, I think is where there's a large opportunity. And I wanted this article to at least be a starting point for the conversations of if there's a roadmap to get this right, when it, to be quite frank, the contextual history has never really started from that place. Then let's start talking about solutions. We've talked a lot about what isn't working and why it isn't working. What are we doing to make it work?
Yeah, and you also mentioned Atlantic Journal-Constitution and how it seems like they've done a good job both in their leadership and also in the initiatives they're doing. I mean, what do you think was kind of helped make them successful in what they're doing?
I mean, I think it's a matter of articulating from the top the need to address it and to find ways that are working. I think that there's a lot of opportunity to make the parallel of how we talk about diversity writ large and how we talk about digital. The idea of experimentation that we take very seriously, we were hard to adapt to within the traditional media outlets. But that approach, I think, is really noteworthy and offers a lot of insight to how we approach diversity. And I think that the examples, including the Atlantic Journal-Constitution, vote to that. So you identify it from the top, you make a commitment to address it, you clearly articulate why it matters and what it's doing, you highlight those successes, and then you continue to experiment even when you find things that maybe aren't as effective as you'd like them to be, because we know that it's an imperative in terms of how the demographics are changing. We know that it's an imperative because that the demographics are going to be what they are, but also because it's tightly tied to the new reality of how we communicate news, and that's through a digital medium, which is overrepresented primarily by people of color. And just one last note, you know, when I'm speaking of diversity in this article, I really wanted to try to be specific about, we were speaking on a very narrow scale around racial and ethnic diversity. We had talked about gender diversity in an earlier article last year that actually recently won an award that did a great job, I think, of breaking down what it means in terms of leadership around women. And obviously diversity expands beyond all of those things, but I just thought that would be noteworthy for the purposes of this conversation.
For sure. And Jeff, what's your take on how, you know, do you feel like newsrooms are making any progress? And also, I'm curious what you think about groups like the Asian American Journalism Association and Unity and all those. Do you feel like they've had an effect in some way?
I think those are two related but obviously distinct questions. There certainly has been improvement. I think that Alicia's article really does a good job of articulating exactly what she said, that we've come a long way, and yet the road ahead is far longer. And when we think about this, I think something that she said in particular, that this is not just an editorial mandate, it is a business mandate, that we are looking at a reality that as a business, the delivery of news, the creation of media, the distribution of content, however you want to speak of it, is increasingly going to an audience and audiences that are themselves diverse. We are living in a country that is undergoing transformative change at every level, and that in many parts of the country already is far and away majority, if you will, minority, to use a term that I think is misleading. But we're speaking now more and more to audiences that look very different from what audiences looked like, sounded like, and lived like 50 years ago. If the news media isn't capable of responding to that change, then it isn't capable of either servicing its constituents or its ultimate mission, its mandate as a business and as a public service. When you talk about entities like AJA and the like, I think one of the things that's really interesting is that these are organizations which, by and large, exist in part to do things that would make themselves unnecessary, right? I mean, these are organizations that are trying to rectify historic imbalances and to, as much as possible, provide a voice for and advocacy to increase the representation of their own groups, both in terms of voice and in terms of number within newsrooms. And yeah, I mean, if they succeed, if we do actually get a proportional and balanced representation of Asian Americans and Hispanics and African Americans and the like in newsrooms, then there will be less need for these individual, distinctive organizations that are advocating for those groups, and maybe we focus more broadly on how to make news better and how to improve the lives and circumstances of journalists. But the fact is that we're not there yet, and I think one of the frustrations we've seen is that even as the conversations around race have gotten more central to our polity and to the headlines and stories that we're covering, it seems as if the people who are being asked to actually capture these stories and tell them to, again, a more diverse audience aren't necessarily the people who have perspectives that are most useful for communicating those. I think we see it time and again that across the full gamut of representation, not just reporting, which I think it's very easy to articulate why you might want to have people inside communities in order to report them more effectively. But in places like opinion journalism, I mean, which is something that I do, we still see that there isn't the kind of diversity of voice as well as representation in terms of background that allows for our communities to truly be represented, not just in issues of quote-unquote race, but as people of different communities within the larger issues that impact society.
Yeah. And Gustavo, what do you think about, there's been a lot of talk about kind of people being on like a race beat. Do you think that's something that most news organizations should have, something looking at ethnicity and diversity, or is it something that should just be part of the entire operation? I mean, how do you feel about that?
When I started in journalism, I sought out as many mentors as possible, and the one that gave me the best advice was Sam Quiñones, amazing writer, one of the best writers ever on Mexican immigration, who just came out with a great book called Dreamland, longtime reporter for the LA Times. And he told me something very telling, because I told him I want to be a great Latino reporter telling stories about the Latino community. And he said flat out, do not let them pigeonhole you. Do not become the guy who could only write Latinos. So while I think it's very important to have coverage, of course it's important to have coverage of diversity and of different communities. That's just what great journalism is. But to put someone specifically as just writing about Latino issues, it really does define and limit that writer. Kind of like what Jeff was saying, like, you know, I'm also an opinion writer. I've been writing for the LA Times and other papers for about a decade now. And at first, they would only come to me saying, like, we just want you to write Latino stuff. And I tell them, well, like, you know, I'm more than just a Latino. I also have thoughts on the war in Iraq. I also have thoughts on the drought in California. But too often, especially I see this in daily journalism, but also even in my media, Vault Weeklies, if you see a person of color or you see someone, you know, self-defining themselves by a beat, you're only going to want them to cover that beat. And that's just too limiting for myself. You know, it's a cliche to say, but unfortunately, given who is at the top at most media empires, they see a person of color, they think they could only really write about that particular community. So putting someone in that pigeonhole of a race beat, I'm not really for it.
You know, Mark, if I could just, this came up in the package that we did for, you know, for Neiman Reports, and Eric Deegans from NPR, you know, wrote specifically about this, and just in terms of, like, this needs to be integrative. It came up in the discussion subsequent to the New York Times eliminating the beat of race and ethnicity at the time last year. So, I mean, I think that it's good to be able to think beyond and expansively about all of your reporters and editors. I also recognize, you know, the value of having a destination and a place where, for communities that have been traditionally ostracized or misrepresented in mainstream organizations, being able to recognize a space. And we've seen a proliferation of those in the last 7 years specifically, whether that was, you know, various blogs. Angry Asian Man gets a shout out. You know, Sapia Mutiny was there for a while. The Griot on NBC, which has since moved and become its own, and now NBC has NBC Black. Whether that was, you know, just a wide variety as it related to, you know, identity spaces, racial issues obviously should be heralded. So, I mean, I think that I've always kind of taken a hybrid approach. I completely understand things need to be integrated. I'm also cognizant of the history and the structural context of why it tends to be ghettoized, because unfortunately, sometimes in very specific organizations, it's not thought of integratively within the way things are covered. And I think that was a lot of the outcry and pushback to, you know, the New York Times eliminating that beat as well. Yeah.
And George, what's your take on that, about having a beat like that? Do you feel, what's your feeling on that?
A beat like that looks pretty comfortable and cozy. It looks like a cardigan sweater. There's something you can wear and be comfy and look respectable. But eventually it will become a straitjacket, and it's not fully reflective of the multiplicity of roles and connections that people have, you know, in their identities and in communities. When I started out, I got a Chips Quinn scholarship and came out to Oakland, and I got some lovely advice and mentorship from Felix Gutierrez and Beverly Keyes. And 20 years later, it's astonishing to be able to still see folks who are coming in along internships like this, getting jobs and getting work. And it's telling to be able to. I'm proud to be able to say I'm part of an organization that continues to commit to bring in folks and let them get their feet wet, and then assess them on their promise, on their ability to cover all kinds of stories, from the Picayune local bookstore closing to the presidential press conference visit, or the a newsmaker event happening. Having that range is a necessity.
Yeah, and what do you think are, I mean, to us it's obvious, but not to everyone, but what are some advantages of having that, bringing in a more diverse newsroom?
It's good for your bottom line. It's good for novel thinking and ideas. It's good for your figure you cut in the community. Essentially, it's a form of engagement on its face. We're used to hearing about engagement in very active, visible terms like events or initiatives that, or collaborations with all kinds of organizations. But there's the kind of engagement that results from having the kind of diverse, well-connected staff that lets you show that you are committed to the mission, the mandate that Jeff described. If you're going to be in these communities, if you're going to be present, and you're diverse, you have a better shot at being able to do your job and continuing to carry out the job.
Yeah, obviously you have a lot more legitimacy in that community if you reflect the community.
And if I could add something to that too, Mark, I mean, I think that the idea, obviously, that is important, the audience we serve and being reflective of that. But if our mission is to explain the world, and particularly in an American context, to be the fourth estate, how can we know what we don't know if we are not representative of that full diaspora of which we are supposed to represent? And I think it doesn't necessarily mean in action that those people from those specific communities have to represent that view all the time. I mean, back to the idea of being expansive enough, because by nature, as journalists, we're curious and we kind of want to go where things we don't necessarily know or need to learn. But I think it really matters and has an impact, editorially speaking, not just in the reporter role, an editorial role to recognize when a story is a story. We saw that very tangibly and specifically with Trayvon Martin, where all three people who highlighted that story in mainstream organizations initially were black men. Because they really probably tangibly understood that from a place, and I thought that was a really interesting example in how that played out. I also know who created the action item. He was a white male who went to Howard University, and I think that just some of the stories that have crossed the transom recently within the last year, you've named many of them, Mark, and it's been really interesting because you have to be able to recognize when a story is a story. You have to be able to translate if we're in the job of explaining the world. And then, the editorial imperatives, I think, have always been there. The Kerner Commission lay those out very specifically. But then there's also the business imperative that, was mentioned earlier, that's a part of just how our businesses are changing so we can survive to do that important work.
Yeah. And what are some steps, I'm curious, Gustavo, for you being an editor, what are some steps towards more diversity? I mean, obviously, okay, hire more diverse people, but we hear from people so many times, well, I can't find the right people, it's so hard, and there's all kinds of excuses thrown out there. What do you think are some steps for really getting more diverse newsrooms out there?
People are being lazy. There's so many talented writers of color, and not just diversity within within ethnicity, but also religion. You just have to go out there and find them. And one of the big problems that I've seen in just the news industry is that there's this over-reliance on getting students from colleges that went to literary journalism school or journalism school. You have to be able, I believe, as an editor, to seek the best writers out no matter what they are. Maybe I believe in this because I'm the best example. I actually went to school in film studies. I had no experience at all as a journalist. I started at the OC Weekly with an angry letter to the editor, which at the time the editor liked it so much, he said, hey, you should write for us. You're kind of crazy. And 15 years later, here I am, the boss of the paper. But my main food critic, for instance, he's from Indonesia. His day job, he's a computer technician who was blogging for himself, and he was an amazing food writer. So he's been our food critic now for about 8 years. We just did a great cover story this week. Came out just yesterday about Mississippi civil rights hero who ended up in Orange County, has kind of remained silent for 40 years. The guy who wrote the story, he works at the Braille Institute where this gentleman would go to, and just by working with him and talking to him, he discovered the civil rights hero. So we can't be so straitjacketed, as was said earlier, to the usual pipeline. So really, when people say, "Oh, I can't find a good Latino writer or a good African American woman writer," they're liars. They're lazy, and frankly, that laziness is the reason why the mainstream media is in the dire straits that it currently is right now.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, the idea of hiring has been concurrent, has been consistent in the last. Since this has really kind of came up in the race riots in the 50s and 60s and civil rights, and obviously when it was in the face, but also with that, I think is an articulation within leadership of the strategies to go forward. We would never think it was. We thought it was crazy when everything started happening with digital that there wasn't necessarily a system or a strategy in how we would approach that and deal with that in very tangible ways, how the newsroom would be reactive to it. Can you imagine a newsroom now without a digital first or without a mobile first strategy? And I think you have to think of, innovation around demographic change in the same way. It's the hiring, absolutely, but if you have, a representative reporter field, but no one at the top can recognize those stories are important or edit them in a way that are nuanced and appropriate, that also really matters. And also kind of determining from, a company perspective why this is important and articulating that, integrating that into larger business goals and making a path toward success. You wouldn't expect that any other way of any other part of the development of company. Why wouldn't you do that for something as essential as the people that you're representing writ large are speaking to?
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I think that that sort of hits the nail on the head, and also kind of, in some ways, reframes the very question that was raised earlier around, it doesn't make sense to have a race beat or race and ethnicity beat versus having it spread out throughout the enterprise, at the editorial level, at the newsroom level, et cetera. The reality is that's not a one or the other. That's not a zero-sum equation. Both of those are in some ways necessary. We are in a world now where race, ethnicity, culture are becoming centralized in key areas on very, very large topics that impact our polity, impact the news that we're covering in every aspect of our lives almost. And there is some need for a dedicated set of individuals who are tracking and reporting and covering those issues because they're coming up so frequently. We are moving towards a pivot point, I think, in our society in which there is need to have that lens and understand better how these changes are occurring and why. At the same time, just because you have that beat doesn't mean you shouldn't have people throughout the newsroom who are diverse covering other beats. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't have editors who are diverse and aware of how to assign those articles as they come up in other categories. It's almost as if you can't play by these rules anymore where tokenism versus integration or isolation versus integration are the rules, and it's a one or the other thing. Right. We need to actually be in a world that is different. We are living in a world that is different, and our industry needs to reflect that.
For sure. Well, thanks for the discussion. It was really good. I appreciate all of your input. I want to thank our panel, Alicia Stewart, Neiman Fellow, George Kelly, Digital First Media, Gustavo Arellano at the OC Weekly, Jeff Yang at the Wall Street Journal, Jefferson Yen, our producer. I want to thank our sponsors, NextSpace and NextKids. You can learn more about their program at nextspace.us/nextkids. And you can catch us each and every week at mediashift.org with the Mediatwits. We'll be off for the next month of July, vacationing and relaxing, and we'll see you back in August. Thanks, everyone.